Something is already happening inside you, not a vague inspirational kind of happening. Something is genuinely, unmistakably coming undone right now. Somewhere in your past, there was a moment you cannot forget. You were in a room full of people, a dinner party, a family gathering, a workplace meeting, and you saw it. The crack beneath the surface, the lie dressed as a smile, the marriage quietly falling apart while everyone raised their glasses. You said nothing, or maybe you tried to say something, and were shut down so cleanly that you learned never to try again. That moment left a mark not because of what you saw, but because of what happened when no one else saw it with you. What Carl Jung spent decades uncovering is that this experience is not a disorder, not a flaw, not a misfire of an overactive imagination. It is something far more complicated, far more consequential, and if understood correctly, far more valuable than you have ever been allowed to believe. Jung called it differentiated perception, and he believed it was one of the most powerful and most dangerous gifts a human being could possess. He first encountered it through a patient he began seeing in the early 1900s. She was highly introverted, extraordinarily intelligent, and deeply miserable, not because her life was objectively terrible. She had a home, people around her, an education, and capability. She was miserable because she could not stop seeing things. She would walk into a dinner party and immediately sense which couple was on the verge of breaking up. She would sit across from a confident coworker and feel the crushing self-doubt beneath the performance. She would listen to a friend describe a new relationship and know, bone deep, that something was wrong, even when every visible sign pointed to happiness. What made it unbearable was not the seeing itself, it was what happened after. When she tried to share what she noticed, people pushed back hard. They called her negative, they told her she was projecting. They accused her of creating problems where none existed. Over time, she stopped saying anything at all. She became quiet, withdrawn. The world felt like a stage and she was stuck watching from the wings. Unable to pretend, she could not see the cracks in the set. Jung recognized immediately that what he was observing was not pathology, not anxiety, not paranoia, not depression, though all three had begun to develop as symptoms of something else entirely. What he was seeing was a person whose capacity for perception had outpaced her ability to live comfortably inside the social world. He wrote about her, and others like her extensively. He noted that these individuals do not simply pick up on obvious emotional cues. They process unconscious signals, the slight tension in a jaw, the fraction of a second delay, before someone answers a question, the way a room goes slightly colder when a certain topic is introduced, the unspoken agreement in a group to never acknowledge what everyone is silently aware of. Jung called these people introverted intuitives, and he believed they made up roughly 1% of the population. He was careful to distinguish them from people who are simply emotionally sensitive, which he estimated at closer to 20%. Sensitivity and differentiated perception are related but not the same. A sensitive person feels deeply. A differentially perceptive person sees deeply. The first is about emotional intensity. The second is about psychological clarity. And clarity, Jung argued, is far more disruptive to social life than intensity. Here is where things get genuinely uncomfortable. Jung observed that social groups, whether families, workplaces, friend circles, or entire communities, function partly through shared agreements about what will not be acknowledged. This sounds cynical, but it is actually just realistic. Every healthy group maintains a certain amount of managed blindness. Nobody calls out every tension the moment it appears. Nobody voices every uncomfortable truth in real time. There is a collective, unspoken agreement to smooth things over, to let certain things go unaddressed, to maintain the surface so that cooperation can continue. This is not always dishonest. Sometimes it is simply practical. But here is the problem. A person with differentiated perception does not automatically participate in that managed blindness. They cannot. They notice the thing that everyone agreed not to notice. And their noticing, even when they say nothing, changes the energy in the room. People can feel when they are being seen too clearly. And when people are uncomfortable and cannot explain why, they search for an explanation they can point to. Frequently, the explanation they land on is the person who made them uncomfortable in the first place. This is what Jung called shadow projection, and it is one of the most important concepts in all of his work. Shadow, in Jungian terms, is the collection of qualities in ourselves that we have decided are unacceptable. The selfishness, the jealousy, the insecurity, the cruelty. We do not eliminate these things by refusing to acknowledge them. We push them underground, out of conscious awareness, into what Jung called the shadow. When someone comes along who can perceive psychological reality clearly, those underground qualities start to feel exposed. The person with differentiated perception may not even be aware of what they are sensing in a precise or articulate way, but their presence functions like a mirror. And when people see something in a mirror they do not want to see, they do not always examine themselves. Sometimes they throw something at the mirror. This is why highly perceptive individuals so often find themselves labeled as the difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who always stirs things up. They did not stir anything up. They walked into a room where things were already stirred, and everyone else had agreed to pretend the water was still. Jung did not treat this population as a single uniform category. He noticed that people with differentiated perception tend to fall into four broad patterns, each with its own particular experience of the gift and its own particular vulnerabilities. First is the feeling perceiver, the person who does not just observe emotional dynamics intellectually, but absorbs them physically. When someone in the room is in pain, the feeling perceiver does not think the thought. They feel the pain in their own chest. When there is unspoken anger nearby, they feel it as a kind of pressure, a weight they cannot fully explain. The challenge is that the line between their own emotional experience and what they are picking up from others becomes almost impossible to locate. They walk into a meeting feeling fine and walk out feeling devastated, without knowing exactly what happened. They end the day exhausted in a way that sleep does not fully fix. The second type is the thinking perceiver, who experiences differentiated perception as pattern recognition. They watch a relationship unfold between two people and quietly, privately, see exactly where it is going. They sit in a job interview and know within minutes whether the company will be a disaster or a good fit, not because of anything explicitly said, but because of the composite picture assembled from dozens of micro-observations. The challenge for this type is the anticipatory grief that comes with seeing outcomes before they arrive. They carry knowledge they cannot use because the moment to act on it has not come, or because saying what they see would not be received. They often appear detached or cold because they have already processed endings that other people are still experiencing as beginnings. The third type is the somatic perceiver, who registers psychological information through the body. They walk into a house and feel whether it is a happy or unhappy home before they have spoken to anyone inside it. They can sense fatigue and illness in others before those people have consciously recognized it in themselves. The challenge is that the world is relentlessly loud on a physical level. Certain spaces, certain crowds, certain combinations of light and sound create a kind of overload that is hard to explain. They are often dismissed as oversensitive or high maintenance, without any recognition of what they are actually processing. The fourth type is the pure intuitive, the rarest and in some ways the most difficult to navigate. The pure intuitive receives vast amounts of perceptual information, but lacks an organized internal system for sorting it. They know things without knowing how they know them. Because they cannot explain their knowing, they often doubt it or suppress it entirely. Without a framework for their perception, they may spend years convinced that something is wrong with them, that they are irrational or unstable, when in fact they are receiving real and often accurate information that simply arrived through an unconventional channel. Jung was not simply interested in describing this experience. He was deeply concerned about what happened to people who carried differentiated perception without ever developing a conscious relationship to it. He identified 3 outcomes he considered genuinely dangerous. The first is chronic isolation, not the kind where someone chooses solitude because they value quiet, but the isolation that comes from feeling fundamentally untranslatable. The person with unintegrated differentiated perception may spend their entire life surrounded by people while feeling like a visitor from a country no one else has been to. They learn to perform belonging without experiencing it. They become fluent in the language of ordinary social life while feeling internally foreign to it. Over time, this creates a particular kind of despair, not the despair of acute loss, but the low, grinding despair of never quite being fully known. The second outcome is psychological destabilization. Jung documented cases where the constant intake of unconscious material from the environment began to erode the individual's sense of their own distinct self. When you absorb other people's emotional and psychological contents continuously without a clear sense of your own boundaries, the question of where you end and others begin stops having an obvious answer. This can produce experiences that look from the outside like depression, anxiety, dissociation, or even early psychosis. But Jung argued that in many cases, the underlying mechanism was not mental illness in any conventional sense. It was perceptual overload combined with identity erosion. He called this condition participation mystique. Third outcome is what Jung called the prophetic complex. When a person has accurate perception, and that perception is consistently rejected, one understandable response is to double down, to become convinced that they are uniquely clear-eyed in a world of the willfully blind, to stop offering insights as possibilities and start offering them as pronouncements. This is a trap, and Jung was very specific about why. The moment a person becomes identified with their own clarity, that clarity begins to curdle. They stop being a witness and start being a judge. And certainty, Jung argued, is almost always a sign that perception has given way to something less useful. He compared this to what happened with Friedrich Nietzsche, who possessed extraordinary perceptual gifts, but never developed the psychological scaffolding to hold them without being consumed by them. The result was a slow collapse into grandiosity and eventually complete psychological breakdown. Here is the part that actually matters. Jung was not a pessimist about this. He spent his career studying what happens when people with differentiated perception successfully integrate their gifts rather than being destroyed by them. And he found that transformation was absolutely possible. Between 1913 and 1919, Jung underwent what he described as a confrontation with the unconscious. He was flooded with overwhelming perceptions and inner experiences that brought him to the edge of what he could bear. He documented everything in what became known as the Red Book. What pulled him through was not suppressing his perception. It was developing a conscious, intentional relationship with it. He called this process individuation. The core of what individuation offers to people with differentiated perception can be broken down into 4 practical stages. The first is recognition and separation, learning to distinguish between what belongs to you and what you are absorbing from your environment. This sounds simple, it is not. For most people with differentiated perception, this distinction has been blurry for so long that the separation takes real sustained practice. Jung's recommendation was consistent solitude, not as a permanent retreat from life, but as a daily practice of returning to yourself. You spend time each day in genuine quiet, without input from screens or conversations or background noise. The absorbed material from your environment begins to settle, and underneath it, slowly, your own authentic psychological voice becomes audible again. Stage 2 is shadow work, the stage most people want to skip because it is genuinely uncomfortable. But Jung was emphatic that you cannot develop clean, uncontaminated perception until you have done serious work on your own shadow. The qualities you most intensely notice in other people are often a reflection of qualities you have not yet fully acknowledged in yourself. Shadow work does not mean self-flagellation or wallowing in shame. It means sitting honestly with the full range of what you are capable of, acknowledging that you contain selfishness and generosity both, cruelty and kindness both. When you can hold that honestly, your perception becomes genuinely clearer rather than just sharper. Stage 3 is conscious participation, the stage where you begin to develop what Jung described as psychological containers, the ability to be present to other people's psychological contents, to truly see and hold what they are carrying, without losing yourself in it or being swept away by it. This is the difference between a first responder and a bystander. A first responder has trained themselves to be fully present to crisis without being destabilized by it. They can be emotionally present and functionally grounded at the same time because they have built an internal structure strong enough to hold the weight. People with differentiated perception, this stage involves learning to be a witness rather than an absorber. You can see what is happening in someone, you can be genuinely moved by it, but you return, always, to your own ground. This requires practice, and it requires learning to consciously modulate how open you are in a given situation. Not every room deserves your fullest awareness. Not every conversation requires you to see everything you are capable of seeing. Learning to manage that is not dishonesty. It is self-preservation and practical wisdom. Stage 4 is what Jung called service without sacrifice. This is the stage that becomes available after the first 3 are genuinely underway. The stage where your perception stops being primarily a source of suffering and starts being something you can offer intentionally. Whatever form it takes, Jung believed that people with integrated differentiated perception have something genuinely rare to offer the world, not because they are better than others, but because they can see things others cannot and communicate those things in ways that help rather than wound. Part of what makes the experience of differentiated perception so exhausting is that most relationships require a degree of self-concealment. You learn to hold back most of what you see. You learn to edit yourself constantly. You learn to perform an ordinary level of awareness, even when you are operating at a completely different altitude. And that performance is depleting in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has never had to do it. Jung argued that finding even a few relationships where this performance is not required can change everything. He identified 3 types of people who tend to be capable of this. The first is what Jung called fellow individuated persons, people who have done their own inner work, who have a conscious relationship with their own psychological complexity, and who are therefore not threatened by being seen clearly. With these people, you do not have to perform ordinary. Second type is people actively engaged in self-examination. They may not share your level of perceptual sensitivity, but they are genuinely curious about their own interior life. They have enough self-awareness to recognize the value of being seen clearly rather than reflexively defending against it. The third type is what Jung called natural containers. People who, regardless of formal psychological development, have a quality of steadiness and groundedness that allows them to hold difficult content without being destabilized by it. These people are your people, and finding them, even if there are only 2 or 3 of them in your entire life, changes the texture of everything. If you have differentiated perception, your daily experience probably includes several things most people around you would not fully understand. You probably have a complicated relationship with gatherings, not necessarily social anxiety, though that may be present too, but a specific kind of fatigue that comes from being in rooms where a lot of unconscious material is circulating. You probably have a pattern of sensing relationship problems before anyone in them acknowledges them. You watch a friend's marriage and feel the trouble 2 years before the separation announcement. You watch a business partnership and feel the fracture point before the fallout. You are in the awkward position of either saying something and being called paranoid, or saying nothing and watching it unfold exactly as you feared. You have probably spent a significant amount of your life quietly wondering if they were right about you. Here is what Jung would tell you. They are not right. They are responding to the discomfort of being seen. That discomfort is real and understandable, but it is not evidence of your malfunction. It is evidence that your perception is working. Jung noticed something in his study of historical figures that is worth knowing. Throughout history, many of the individuals who eventually turned out to be right about something important were considered, during their own lifetimes, to be difficult, eccentric, or troubling. They saw things too clearly. They named what others agreed not to name. They refused, or were unable, to participate in the managed blindness of their time and place. This does not mean that everyone who considers themselves a misunderstood visionary actually is one. The prophetic complex Jung warned about is real, and it is a trap. But it does mean something specific about the relationship between clear perception and collective resistance. The two tend to go together. Clarity that matters has always been unpopular before it was essential. Jung believed that people with integrated differentiated perception serve a particular function in the larger human story. They sense, often before it is visible to the collective, the patterns that are not working, the unacknowledged tensions, the shadow material that a culture, a family, or an organization is carrying and not dealing with. And they carry that awareness, often at significant personal cost, until the moment arrives when it can be received. He called this being a consciousness pioneer, not a prophet, not a savior, but a pioneer. Someone who travels ahead into territory that others will eventually arrive at, mapping it not for glory, but because that is simply the direction their perception takes them. There is a version of this gift that destroys people. It is the version where you spend your life seeing clearly and suffering alone, absorbing everyone else's pain without adequate protection, being blamed for reflecting what others refuse to examine, and growing smaller and quieter until the gift is buried under enough accumulated exhaustion that you can barely feel it anymore. There is another version. It is the version where you do the work of integration, where you learn to distinguish your own psychological material from what you absorb from others, where you examine your own shadow honestly enough that your perception becomes clean instead of contaminated, where you develop the internal structures that allow you to be fully present to complexity without being destroyed by it, where you find the few people in your life with whom you do not have to perform ordinary, and where you learn to offer what you see in ways that serve rather than wound. That version is not easy. It requires genuine work over a sustained period of time. It requires more self-honesty than most people are willing to bring to anything. But it is possible. Jung documented it in his patients. He lived it himself. And the people who achieve it, he argued, become something genuinely valuable. Not perfect, not without struggle, but increasingly capable of doing something that very few people in any given room can do. Seeing what is actually happening, holding it without flinching, and offering it with enough skill and care that it lands as medicine. rather than injury. You are not too much. You are not broken. You are not the problem in every room where problems surface. You are a person whose perception is set to a frequency that most people cannot tune into. The work in front of you is not to lower that frequency to match the people around you. The work in front of you is to become equal to what you carry. That is not a small task, but it is yours. And from what Jung observed, it is worth doing.